The invisible hands. How family offices secretly run the world. There's a fair room somewhere in Manhattan where decisions worth more than most countries' GDP are made in whispered conversations. The men and women in that room don't appear on Forbes lists. They don't give interviews. They don't even officially exist in any database you could access. Yet they control more wealth than the bottom half of humanity combined. Tonight, I'm going to take you inside the shadow financial architecture that these invisible titans have spent centuries perfecting. This isn't a story about money. This is a story about power, so absolute, so carefully concealed, that most people don't even know they're living under its influence. Welcome to the world of family offices. Welcome to the machinery that runs our reality. What I'm about to reveal will fundamentally alter how you perceive wealth, power, and the very nature of global control. Because while you've been watching politicians debate and markets fluctuate, the real decisions about humanity's future have been made in boardrooms that don't appear on any building directory, by families whose names you've never heard, using financial instruments so sophisticated they make quantum physics look like elementary mathematics. The term family office sounds benign, almost quaint, like something your grandfather's accountant might run out of a small office above, a delicatessen. But these aren't your grandfather's accountants. These are the architects of invisible empires, the guardians of dynastic wealth so vast that nations bend to accommodate their interests. A family office is essentially a private wealth management company that serves ultra-high net worth individuals and families. But that clinical definition barely scratches the surface of what they really are. The nerve centers of financial power that operate beyond the reach of governments, regulators, and public scrutiny. Consider this: while the world's attention focuses on tech billionaires and oil magnates whose fortunes are plastered across magazine covers, the real money, the generational wealth that shapes civilizations, remains completely invisible. The families I'm talking about don't just have money. They have infrastructure. They have networks that span continents and centuries. They have legal structures so complex that an army of forensic accountants couldn't unravel them in a lifetime. These family offices manage approximately $26 trillion globally. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 30% of all investable assets on Earth. Yet most people have never heard the term. This isn't an accident. This is by design. Because when your wealth reaches a certain threshold, visibility becomes a liability, and invisibility becomes the ultimate luxury. The sophistication of modern wealth preservation makes the old Swiss bank account look like a piggy bank on a kitchen counter. We're talking about structures so layered, so jurisdictionally complex, that they exist in a parallel financial universe where normal rules simply don't apply. These aren't just tax avoidance schemes. These are alternate realities where wealth transcends borders, laws, and even governments. Let me paint you a picture of how this actually works. Imagine a Russian oligarch who wants to buy a penthouse in London, but he doesn't want his name anywhere near the transaction. So he creates a Delaware corporation, which is owned by a British Virgin Islands company, which is controlled by a Liechtenstein Foundation, which is managed by a Swiss trust, which receives its funding from a Cayman Islands hedge fund, which gets its capital from a Singapore family office. The apartment is purchased through 7 jurisdictions, 5 time zones, and 3 continents. The oligarch's name never appears on a single document, yet he controls every aspect of the transaction. This isn't theoretical. This is Tuesday afternoon for the global elite. The offshore world isn't just about hiding money. It's about creating parallel legal systems where wealth operates under different physics. In these jurisdictions, companies can exist without shareholders, trusts can operate without beneficiaries, and foundations can function without purposes. They've created legal black holes where money goes invisible and comes out invisible. The British Virgin Islands, a Caribbean paradise of 60 square miles, hosts more than 1 million active companies. That's roughly 20,000 companies per square mile. making it mathematically impossible for them to have any real business presence. These aren't companies in any meaningful sense. They're ghosts in the machine. Corporate phantoms that exist solely to obscure the flow of capital from its source to its destination. But the real genius isn't in the individual structures, it's in how they connect. Modern wealth preservation operates like a neural network, with nodes scattered across the globe, each performing a specific function in the larger organism. A Delaware corporation holds the assets, a Swiss trust provides the banking, a Singapore family office manages the investments, a Cayman fund provides the liquidity, and a Liechtenstein foundation ensures the legal protection. Each piece appears legitimate in isolation, but together they form something unprecedented in human history. Wealth that exists everywhere and nowhere. Simultaneously, the families who perfected this system didn't build it overnight. They've been refining it for generations, each crisis teaching them new ways to insulate their fortunes from the chaos that periodically consumes the rest of us. The Rothschilds, who at their peak controlled more wealth than entire empires, pioneered the concept of geographical diversification, not just of assets, but of legal structures. They understood that putting all your eggs in one basket applies not just to investments, but to jurisdictions. When Napoleon was rampaging across Europe, traditional wealth structures crumbled under the weight of war and revolution. But the Rothschilds' wealth survived because it existed in multiple legal frameworks simultaneously. They could be simultaneously French, German, British, and Austrian, without being beholden to any single sovereign. This wasn't tax avoidance. This was sovereignty arbitrage. The Rockefellers took this concept even further, creating what we now recognize as the modern foundation structure. But their innovations went far beyond philanthropy. They understood that perpetual institutions could outlive governments, outlast economic systems, and transcend the mortal limitations of their creators. A Rockefeller Foundation established in 1913 operates under legal frameworks that predate the Federal Reserve, the Internal Revenue Service, and most of the regulatory apparatus we consider immutable today. These weren't just wealthy families managing their money. These were dynasties engineering their own immortality. If you're starting to grasp the magnitude of what I'm describing, if you're beginning to understand that the world operates on two completely different sets of rules, depending on your net worth, then you're ready for what comes next. But first, I need you to do something. I need you to hit that like button, not because I'm asking for engagement, but because this information needs to reach people who still believe the system operates fairly. Share this with someone who thinks wealth inequality is just about some people working harder than others. Because what you're about to learn will shatter that illusion completely. The techniques I've described so far are just the foundation. The real sophistication begins when we examine how these structures interact with the global banking system. Swiss banks, despite their legendary reputation for secrecy, are actually just the tip of the iceberg. The real action happens in jurisdictions you've never heard of. Using techniques so advanced, they make traditional Swiss numbered accounts look like stone tablets. Private banking today operates on a principle called know your customer everywhere, except where it matters most. A middle-class individual trying to open a savings account faces more scrutiny than a family office transferring billions through structured products that don't technically exist. This isn't hypocrisy. This is intentional architecture. The most sophisticated wealth preservation strategies use something called economic substance without legal ownership. This means the family controls the assets, receives all the benefits, and makes all the decisions, but legally owns nothing. They've achieved what alchemists dreamed of for centuries. They've made wealth intangible while keeping its power absolute. Consider the typical structure of a modern dynastic trust. The family creates a trust in South Dakota, which has no state income tax and allows trusts to exist in perpetuity. That trust owns a Delaware corporation, which holds membership interests in a series of Wyoming limited liability companies. which own shares in Cayman Islands mutual funds, which invest in Singapore-based hedge funds, which purchase derivatives from Swiss private banks collateralized by assets held in New Zealand trusts, managed by Liechtenstein foundations. The legal ownership becomes more obscure while the economic control remains absolute. The family that created this structure has access to billions in assets, but if you tried to sue them, you'd discover they legally own nothing. If a government tried to tax them, they'd find no taxable events in any single jurisdiction. If investigators tried to trace the money, they'd encounter legal barriers in dozens of countries, each operating under different legal systems with different disclosure requirements. This isn't wealth management. This is legal warfare waged against the concept of accountability itself. The Panama Papers, released in 2016, provided the world with its first glimpse into this shadow architecture. But what the public saw was just a single law firm's client list. Mossack Fonseca was mid-tier at best in the offshore world. The real players, the architects of truly generational wealth, use structures so sophisticated that they wouldn't trust their details to any single firm or any single jurisdiction. The Paradise Papers, which followed a year later, revealed something even more disturbing. It wasn't just corrupt politicians and drug dealers using these structures. It was everyone. Queen Elizabeth II, the European Union's commissioners, cabinet ministers from democratic governments, university endowments, charitable foundations, and pension funds managing retirement savings for teachers and firefighters. The offshore world wasn't a criminal conspiracy. It was the operating system for global capital. But even these revelations only scratched the surface, because the families who truly run this system learned long ago that the greatest secrets are hidden in plain sight. The most powerful wealth preservation strategies don't rely on secrecy. They rely on complexity so overwhelming that, even when the structures are public, no one can understand them well enough to challenge them. Take the typical sovereign wealth fund. On paper, these are investment vehicles owned by governments and operated for the benefit of their citizens. In reality, many function as private family offices for ruling dynasties, using state resources to generate private wealth while maintaining the legal fiction of public ownership. The Qatar Investment Authority, which controls over $400 billion, operates with less transparency than a corner grocery store, yet it shapes global markets through investments that blur the line between state policy and private profit. The Norwegian government, Pension Fund Global, the world's largest sovereign wealth fund with over $1 trillion in assets, follows strict ethical guidelines that prohibit investments in companies involved in weapons, tobacco, or environmental destruction. Yet through its network of external managers and structured products, it maintains exposure to every sector it officially shuns. The ethical guidelines aren't deception, they're misdirection. While the public focuses on the fund's stated principles, the real money flows through channels that exist beyond the reach of those principles. This is the genius of modern wealth preservation, creating systems so complex that moral responsibility becomes mathematically impossible to assign. When wealth flows through 47 legal entities across 23 jurisdictions, managed by 14 different firms operating under 7 regulatory frameworks, who exactly is responsible for the consequences of how that wealth is deployed? The answer is no one, which means the answer is everyone, which means the answer is no one. This isn't accidental ambiguity. This is engineered irresponsibility. The technological revolution has supercharged these capabilities. Which was supposedly designed to democratize finance, has become the ultimate tool for wealth obscuration. While governments struggle to understand blockchain technology, family offices have been using it for years to create financial structures that exist entirely outside traditional banking systems. But they're not using Bitcoin. They're not using Ethereum. They're using private blockchains that operate like financial internets, accessible only to the ultra-wealthy. These networks allow instant settlement of transactions worth billions of dollars without any regulatory oversight, without any paper trail, and without any geographical limitations. Wealth can now move from New York to Singapore to London to Dubai in seconds, automatically adjusting its legal structure to optimize for tax efficiency, regulatory arbitrage, and asset protection in real time. Artificial intelligence has made this even more sophisticated. Modern family offices use AI systems to continuously monitor global regulatory changes, tax law modifications, and political developments across hundreds of jurisdictions simultaneously. When a new regulation threatens their structure in one country, the AI automatically suggests alternative frameworks in others. When a political election might affect their interests, the AI calculates the probability of various outcomes and hedges accordingly. When a new investment opportunity emerges anywhere in the world, the AI determines the optimal structure for capturing it while minimizing exposure. These aren't just wealthy people with good accountants. These are cybernetic organisms designed for the accumulation and preservation of capital across all possible futures. The families using these systems think in time frames that span centuries. They're not trying to get rich. They're trying to ensure their descendants remain the dominant economic force on Earth, long after our current political systems have crumbled into historical footnotes. They've studied the rise and fall of empires, the collapse of currencies, the revolution of governments, and the transformation of entire economic systems. They've engineered their wealth to survive all of it. When the Roman Empire fell, the wealth of the Roman elite vanished with it. When the British Empire declined, British aristocratic fortunes evaporated. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Soviet state assets were looted and scattered. But the families who perfected modern wealth preservation have created structures designed to transcend the rise and fall of any single civilization. You're witnessing the evolution of a new form of power, one that doesn't depend on controlling territory or commanding armies or winning elections. This is power that derives from controlling the fundamental systems through which all other forms of power must operate. When every government needs to borrow money, when every corporation needs investment, when every economy needs capital flows, the families who control those systems control everything without appearing to control anything. If this is resonating with you, if you're beginning to see the matrix of control that most people remain oblivious to, then you need to become part of the small group of people who understand how the world really works. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, not because you want to see more videos, but because you want to join the ranks of the initiated. This channel isn't entertainment, it's intelligence. It's preparation for operating in a world where knowledge of these systems determines whether you're predator or prey. Welcome to the inner circle. The scale of what I'm describing becomes clear when you examine specific case studies. The HSBC scandal, which emerged in 2012, revealed that one of the world's largest banks had been operating essentially as a money laundering operation for drug cartels, terrorist organizations, and sanctioned governments. But what the public focused on was the criminal activity. What they missed was the infrastructure that made it possible. HSBC wasn't just a bank that occasionally broke the rules. It was a network of over 3,000 subsidiaries operating in 84 countries under dozens of different regulatory frameworks. When money entered this network, it became impossible to trace, not because HSBC was particularly clever, but because the complexity of the system made traditional oversight mathematically impossible. Regulators trying to monitor HSBC's activities would need to understand the banking laws of 84 different countries, the corporate structures of 3,000 different entities, and the relationships between thousands of correspondents, banks, shell companies, and trust structures. The bank ultimately paid a fine of $1.9 billion, which sounds enormous until you realize it represented approximately 5 weeks of profit. More importantly, the infrastructure that enabled the violations remained completely intact. HSBC didn't change its fundamental structure. It just promised to be more careful about who it did business with. This wasn't a case of corporate criminals getting away with murder. This was a demonstration that the global financial system has evolved beyond the point where traditional regulation is possible. When wealth preservation structures become sufficiently complex, the distinction between legal and illegal becomes purely academic. The Credit Suisse scandal that finally destroyed the bank in 2023 revealed something even more disturbing. The bank wasn't just helping wealthy clients avoid taxes or hide assets. It was actively creating financial products designed to circumvent international sanctions, enable tax evasion, and facilitate money laundering, then marketing these products to clients around the world. But the bank's executives weren't rogue operators. They were responding to competitive pressure from other institutions offering similar services. The entire private banking industry had evolved into a sophisticated criminal enterprise, but one that operated within the technical boundaries of existing laws. They had discovered that if you make your violations sufficiently complex and distribute them across enough jurisdictions, the legal system becomes incapable of processing them as crimes. When Credit Suisse finally collapsed, its clients didn't lose their money. They simply transferred their accounts to other institutions offering identical services under different names. The infrastructure survived even though the institution died. But these scandals, as revealing as they are, only show us the crude mechanics of wealth preservation. The families who truly understand this system don't rely on banks at all. They've created their own financial institutions, their own regulatory frameworks, and their own enforcement mechanisms. They operate in a jurisdiction that exists above and beyond any government on earth. The Rothschild family, despite their legendary status, are actually newcomers to this game. The real masters of generational wealth preservation are families, whose names you've never heard, whose fortunes predate modern record-keeping, and whose power derives not from what they own, but from what they control. These families understood centuries ago that direct ownership creates vulnerability. If you own something, it can be seized, taxed, regulated, or confiscated. But if you control something without owning it, you have all the benefits with none of the risks. They've spent generations perfecting the art of invisible control. They don't own the banks. They control the people who do. They don't own the corporations. They control the funds that do. They don't own the governments. They control the systems that fund them. This isn't conspiracy. This is evolution. Natural selection applied to wealth. Preservation has produced entities that exist beyond the reach of any earthly power. Consider how modern central banking actually works. The Federal Reserve, despite its name, isn't federal and has no reserves. It's a private corporation owned by member banks, which are themselves owned by holding companies, which are controlled by investment funds, which are managed by family offices whose beneficial owners are impossible to identify. When the Federal Reserve creates money, it's not really the US government creating money. It's a network of private interests creating money for their own benefit and calling it monetary policy. The European Central Bank operates under a similar structure, as does the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, and virtually every other central bank on Earth. The families who control the global monetary system don't need to own gold or silver or Bitcoin. They own the ability to create money itself. When you understand this, every other economic phenomenon suddenly makes sense. Financial crises aren't random events caused by market forces. They're periodic wealth transfers orchestrated by the families who control the money supply. When asset prices collapse, ordinary people lose their savings, their homes, and their businesses. But the families who saw the collapse coming use their unlimited access to capital to purchase those assets at fire sale prices. This isn't market manipulation in the traditional sense. This is market orchestration. The entire global economy operates as a machine designed to concentrate wealth at the top, while maintaining the illusion that markets are natural forces beyond human control. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a perfect case study in how this system operates. While small businesses shuttered, supply chains collapsed, and millions lost their jobs, the wealth of billionaires increased by over $2 trillion. This wasn't because they were better at adapting to changed circumstances. This was because they had advanced access to the policy responses that governments would implement. When lockdowns were announced, they had already positioned themselves in the companies that would benefit. When governments announced stimulus programs, they had already structured their holdings to capture the maximum benefit. When central banks announced quantitative easing programs, they had already positioned themselves to receive the newly created money first, before it diluted the currency for everyone else. They weren't lucky, they weren't prescient, they weren't particularly skilled investors. They simply had access to information and infrastructure that allowed them to profit from a global catastrophe while the rest of humanity suffered through it. This is how the system has always worked. Every major historical crisis has resulted in wealth concentration, not because crises naturally favor the wealthy, but because the wealthy have engineered systems that convert crises into opportunity for them and opportunity into crises for everyone else. The families who perfected this understand that true power comes not from accumulating wealth, but from controlling the systems that determine how wealth is created, distributed, and preserved. They've achieved something unprecedented in human history. They've made themselves economically immortal while keeping everyone else economically mortal. And the most disturbing part isn't that this system exists, it's that it's accelerating. Every new crisis makes them more powerful. Every new regulation makes their competitive advantage larger. Every new technology makes their control more sophisticated. While everyone else adapts to changes in the system, they control the system that creates the changes. They've transcended the traditional cycles of boom and busts that have constrained wealth for millennia. They've created a system where they profit from growth and they profit from contraction, where they benefit from inflation and they benefit from deflation, where they gain from war and they gain from peace. They've achieved the alchemical dream of turning every possible outcome into gold. If you've made it this far, if you're beginning to comprehend the true architecture of power in our world, then you're ready for the final revelation. But first, I need you to prove you're serious about understanding these realities. Comment below with the word invisible to show you understand that the most powerful forces in our world are the ones you can't see. And share this with someone who still believes that hard work and fair play determine success in our economic system, because what I'm about to reveal will explain why those beliefs, however noble, are completely irrelevant to how wealth and power actually function. The ultimate sophistication in wealth preservation isn't legal or financial. It's psychological. The families who truly run the world have learned to make their dominance invisible, not just to regulators and investigators, but to themselves. They've created systems so complex, so distributed, so seemingly natural, that even they can maintain the fiction that they're not really in control. This is the final evolution of power. Control so absolute that it appears to be chaos, so systematic that it seems spontaneous, so overwhelming that it becomes invisible. They've achieved what every tyrant in history dreamed of, but none could accomplish. They've made their tyranny feel like freedom. The modern global economy isn't a collection of separate national markets connected by trade relationships. It's a single, integrated system designed to ensure that wealth flows upward, regardless of local conditions, political systems, or economic policies. Every apparent choice is actually a forced move in a game whose rules were written by players who don't appear on the board. When you vote in elections, you're choosing between candidates whose campaigns are funded by the same sources. When you invest in the stock market, you're buying shares in companies controlled by the same investment funds. When you shop for products, you're choosing between brands owned by the same parent corporations. When you borrow money, you're paying interest to banks owned by the same holding companies. The appearance of choice, competition, and democracy serves to legitimize a system that has eliminated all three. This isn't accidental. This is the most sophisticated form of social control ever devised, giving people the illusion of agency while ensuring that all their choices produce the same outcome. The families who engineered this system understand something that most people never grasp. The most effective control is invisible control. Overt tyranny creates resistance. Invisible tyranny creates compliance. When people can't see their chains, they don't try to break them. They've created a world where rebellion is impossible because there's nothing concrete to rebel against. How do you fight an enemy that doesn't officially exist? How do you resist a system that appears to be natural law? How do you protest against institutions that seem to be helping you? The genius of this system is that it converts resistance into reinforcement. Every attempt to reform the system strengthens it. Every effort to regulate it gives it new tools for control. Every crisis that threatens it becomes an opportunity for it to consolidate power. When activists demand higher taxes on the wealthy use their political influence to create tax laws that appear progressive, but actually accelerate wealth concentration. When regulators try to restrict financial speculation, the wealthy create new financial instruments that are even more speculative. When governments attempt to break up monopolies, the wealthy create new forms of corporate structure that are even more monopolistic. They've achieved something that would have amazed Machiavelli. They've made their subjects accomplices in their own subjugation. The people demanding change are demanding changes that make the system more powerful. The people fighting for justice are fighting for justice that serves injustice. The people seeking freedom are seeking freedom that ensures their enslavement. This isn't malice. This isn't even conscious planning. This is the inevitable result of a system that has evolved to optimize for wealth concentration over human flourishing. Like any complex system, it has developed emergent properties that serve its own survival, regardless of the intentions of the people operating within it. The families who control this system aren't evil masterminds plotting global domination. They're products of the system just as much as its creators. They've been shaped by generations of wealth preservation to think in ways that ensure the system's perpetuation. They genuinely believe they're serving the greater good by ensuring that capital remains efficiently allocated by the most qualified stewards. And in a sense, they're right. The system they've created is incredibly efficient at what it's designed to do: convert human energy into concentrated wealth. It's just that what it's designed to do is completely disconnected from what most people think it's supposed to do. Most people believe the economic system exists to allocate resources fairly, reward merit, and provide opportunities for advancement. But the system actually exists to ensure that wealth, once accumulated, can never be lost, and that power, once concentrated, can never be challenged. These two purposes are not just different, they're mutually exclusive. A system designed to preserve existing wealth cannot simultaneously create opportunities for new wealth. A system designed to concentrate power cannot simultaneously distribute it democratically. The contradiction is resolved by creating the appearance of the second while ensuring the reality of the first. People are given opportunities that lead nowhere, competitions that are predetermined, and choices that don't matter. They're kept busy pursuing goals that, even if achieved, won't fundamentally alter their position in the system. This is why social mobility has declined, even as educational opportunities have increased. This is why innovation has slowed even as research spending has grown. This is why democracy has weakened, even as voting rights have expanded. The system has evolved beyond the point where traditional mechanisms of change can affect it. The families who control this system have achieved something unprecedented in human history. They've made their power hereditary not through legal inheritance, but through systemic design. Their children don't need to inherit their wealth to inherit their power. because the system itself ensures that power accumulates too. People with their characteristics, regardless of their individual choices. They've transcended the traditional limitations of human mortality by embedding their preferences into the operating system of civilization itself. Even if every member of these families disappeared tomorrow, the system they created would continue functioning exactly as it does today, because it's no longer dependent on their direct control. This is the final stage of wealth preservation, creating systems that preserve not just money, but the entire social structure that generates wealth concentration. They've achieved institutional immortality, and the most remarkable thing about this achievement is that it's completely invisible to almost everyone living within it. The system has become so sophisticated that it can hide its own existence from the people it controls. It's created a world where its own impossibility serves as proof of its non-existence. When you try to explain these realities to people, they reject them not because the evidence is insufficient, but because accepting them would require acknowledging that everything they believe about fairness, merit, and opportunity is an illusion. The psychological investment in these beliefs is so great that people will reject overwhelming evidence rather than question their fundamental assumptions about how the world works. This isn't stupidity. This isn't ignorance. This is perfectly rational behavior in a system that punishes awareness and rewards compliance. People who understand how the system really works are dangerous to it. So the system has evolved mechanisms to discourage understanding and encourage comfortable delusions. The families who benefit from this system aren't different from other people in their fundamental psychology. They've simply been placed in positions where understanding these realities serves their interests rather than threatening them. If you had been born into their circumstances, you would likely think exactly as they do. The tragedy isn't that some people are evil and others are good. The tragedy is that we've created a system that makes ethical behavior economically irrational and unethical behavior economically inevitable. The families who control global wealth aren't choosing to exploit the system. They're choosing to survive within it, and survival requires exploitation. This is what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. The most destructive systems aren't operated by monsters. They're operated by ordinary people, doing what seems rational within the constraints they face. The constraints just happen to be designed to produce monstrous outcomes. The system of invisible wealth preservation that we've described tonight represents the culmination of centuries of evolution in social control. It's achieved something that no previous system of domination ever managed. It's made itself invisible, inevitable, and beneficial to the people it exploits. But systems, no matter how sophisticated, are not natural laws. They're human creations, which means they can be human uncreations. The first step in changing any system is seeing it clearly. The second step is refusing to participate in the comfortable illusions that maintain it. The families who run the world have spent centuries perfecting the art of invisible control. But invisibility is also vulnerability. Systems that depend on remaining hidden can be destroyed by exposure. Systems that depend on complexity can be defeated by simplification. Systems that depend on compliance can be overthrown by refusal. The question isn't whether this system can be changed. The question is whether enough people will choose to see it clearly enough to demand that change. Because once you understand how the game is really played, you can never again pretend that losing is your fault, or that winning is impossible. The invisible hands that shape our world are only invisible until you learn to see them. Once you do, you realize that they're not supernatural forces beyond human influence. They're human institutions created by human decisions, maintained by human compliance, and vulnerable to human resistance. The choice, as it has always been, is yours. You can continue living in the comfortable illusion that the system is natural, fair, and beyond your influence. Or you can acknowledge the reality that the system is artificial, rigged, and maintained by your participation in its mechanisms. Either choice is valid. But only one of them offers the possibility of change. The invisible hands that run our world are powerful because they remain invisible. The moment they become visible, they become vulnerable. And in that vulnerability lies the only hope for a future where wealth serves humanity rather than the other way around. The revelation is complete. What you do with it is up to you.